to today's event, The Future of Tech-Enabled Democracy, Rejecting the Race to the Bottom, hosted by the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, and Stanford Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, CDDRL. I'm Luisa Tomar, a program officer at CIPE, and today's event features a fireside chat between Frank Fukuyama and Lucy Bernholz about the intersection of technology and democracy and how we get to the shared future that we all want and benefits us all. Thank you for joining us today. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the program, and I'll do my best to get to all of them during the question and answer portion. Please note that this event is being recorded and streamed on Facebook Live, and be sure to stick around to the end to hear from Lauren Weitzman about the Local Democracy in Action grants for CIPE partners and Leadership Network for Change Fellows. We will also be posting a sign-up sheet in the chat for CIPE partners and LNC members to help facilitate connections and collaboration. We're delighted to have CIPE's Executive Director, Andrew Wilson, joining us to offer some opening remarks. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Luisa, and I'd like to extend my own personal welcome to our CDDRL staff and participants from the Leadership Network for Change, as well as our CIPE staff and partners who are joining us today for this discussion. You know, CIPE has had a long history of working with Stanford. Frank and the CDDRL team on the Leadership for Academy for Development programs spanning Ukraine, Tunisia, Iraq, and now Ethiopia. It was one of the first initiatives CIPE undertook when I became executive director, and it's really wonderful to see it mature into the robust program that it is today. And it's great that we're expanding our partnership and leveraging the expertise across our communities to tackle some of today's greatest challenges. The rapid digital transformation happening across the globe, especially in response to COVID-19, is providing many new opportunities for business. But we're also facing complex threats from digital authoritarianism, surveillance, internet shutdowns, and the shrinking of civic spaces on and offline, as well as sophisticated and targeted misinformation campaigns. You know, at CIPE, we consider ourselves optimists, but not naive. And we see the incredible work our partners do, especially when we think global and act local. And it's in that spirit, we hope many of our partners and the LNC fellows will submit applications for local democracy and action grants and work together to find solutions that keep the digital age hospitable to our shared democratic values and our common ambitions for economic inclusion and opportunity. I want to extend my personal thanks to you, Frank and Lucy, for helping us envision this positive role for technology in our democracies and societies. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Stanford's Mosbacher Director, Frank Fukuyama, and Senior Research Scholar, Lucy Bernholz. Frank, I'm handing the floor over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It really has been a pleasure working with CIPE over the last few years on our Leadership Academy programs, and I look forward to continuing the partnership. So Lucy and I want to talk about both the general conditions for democracy and how that's been affected by the digital age, and then talk about some concrete remedies for some of the ills that we have been experiencing. Just as general background, I think that everybody is aware that when the internet was commercialized back in the late 1990s, most people, including myself, thought that this would be a terrific boon for democracy. Information was power, and to the extent that you were spreading information out more broadly through networks, you were going to spread power out, and you were going to allow people opportunities for mobilization and for political participation. And, you know, I think we have to recognize that that promise has remained true, and it is still the case that the internet is a terrific vehicle for both mobilization and for participation. But what we've recognized also is that it can be weaponized and it can be used by people who are basically enemies of democracy for their own anti-democratic purposes. And that's both hostile authoritarian powers like Russia and China, but it's also been coming from populist movements and other civil society actors in existing Western democracies. I think the problem is very well summarized in a new book by Jonathan Rauch from the Brookings Institution entitled The Constitution of Knowledge. It was just issued finally this past week. And in it, he talks about, the question of truth and how is it that we actually have any idea that a fact is true. And he argues that it's basically a social process, that we've created in a way, a hierarchy of institutions or a social network in which scientific discovery is conducted. It's not done by individuals. It's really done by a system by which hypotheses are stated, evidence is gathered, and then there's a discussion that leads to a winnowing of both factual and causal statements to the point where there's a broad social consensus, let's say about the reality of something like global warming. It's not based on the authority of any one individual. It really is a byproduct of this social interaction. And that is something that's evolved really since the Enlightenment, this whole system of knowledge gathering and knowledge verification. But when you get to the internet, he says, you've created this machine that puts almost all of those features into reverse. So rather than winnowing information, discarding bad information, having credentials and authorities that will vet information and make sure that only things that pass a certain kind of social muster will be regarded as truthful or a causal assertion or something of that sort. What the internet has done, the commercial internet, is almost the reverse, that it's accelerated the flow of bad information because the underlying incentives that the internet platforms face is really attention, eyeballs, and the like. And that doesn't come from boring, factual, verified assertions. It comes from things that are outrageous or trolling or other forms of social provocation. And so it's as if you've created this big machine that actually takes the common factual objective basis for democratic deliberation and turns it on its head. And that leads to outcomes like the ones we're seeing today, where according to recent poll data, something like 1/3 of Americans believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, that Donald Trump was actually the winner of it, but he was the victim of massive fraud. And obviously you can't run democratic institutions where you have that, or you certainly can't run them effectively where you have that degree of lack of factual agreement. The other thing I think that's happening really has to do with the concentration of power that the internet has made possible. Part of the reason we thought that the digital revolution would be democratizing was, as I said, the fact that it spreads power out. But many of the technological trends have done the reverse. They've actually concentrated power. So one manifestation of this are Google and Facebook, because of so-called network economies and economies of scale. It turns out that the larger your network is, the larger it gets, because people benefit from being part of a large network rather than a small one. And so that's led to this unbelievable concentration of power in just a very small handful of companies. The other respect in which power is being concentrated has to do with the nature of the technology, with the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Instead of everybody having a powerful computer on their desktop and then a powerful computer in their pocket in the form of their smartphone, today some of the most important uses of computing are in the cloud, and they reside with large companies and indeed with large countries. And so one of the reasons that China has become a leader in AI is that it's got a lot of people and a lot of data, something that a much smaller country could not enjoy, and that allows it to dominate things like sensor technology and surveillance and other technologies that again tend to concentrate rather than to spread power out. So with that, let me turn things over to Lucy to talk about some more of the background conditions for the political phenomena we're seeing and how that has been affected by the rise of, or the changing nature of technology.
Thanks, Frank. And thanks to the hosts for having me and for everybody for joining me. I'm Lucy Bernholtz. I run something called the Digital Civil Society Lab, which is located at Stanford. And I want to build on what Frank said and extend it a little bit further. When we created the Digital Civil Society Lab, the phenomenon that we were concerned about, and this was almost a decade ago at this point, and in partnership with my colleague Rob Reich in the political science department, the concern was very basic. The typical theoretical understanding of particularly Western liberal democracies and also 20th century history. I'm an historian, Rob is a political philosopher, so you can see where these groundings are coming from. 20th century history shows us that democracies really need some form of independent space, which we'll refer to here as civil society, although that term has a lot of different meanings, is separate from the marketplace and separate from our actions in the public sphere, specifically with governments, in order to thrive. And that's because of this basic sort of democratic assumption that's so ingrained in us, we rarely stop to think about it, except when we don't experience it, which is that a majority is making the decisions that are going to govern the rest of us. And what the civil space sort of requirement serves, the function it serves, is as a place for minority action, whether that's ideological, defined by demographic characteristics, religious, whatever it is. There needs to be a space where those views and ideas and powers and systems and desires that aren't being particularly served by the government or the marketplace can actually thrive. It's an escape valve. It's a release valve, and there needs to be some form of independence for that to thrive. And what's happened is, building off of what Frank said, in the way the commercial internet has grown and its relationships to governments, is that the nominally independent civic space we have to come together as individuals, share ideas, share beliefs, organize to make change in either of those other two spheres, that space is now entirely dependent on the infrastructure and incentives of the other two spaces, either on literally the tools and resources and systems and infrastructure of the commercial internet, or on the state-run versions of those things. So there really is no independent civic space in the way that we have conceptualized and actually codified what that space is supposed to do. And with the collapse of that independent space and the concentration of powers, as Frank has mentioned, we're experiencing democratic shifts and collapses and threats in all kinds of contexts. And I think in some ways it's that very that may not be the singular reason, but it's certainly a part of what we're experiencing. Building on what Frank talked about in terms of knowledge and understanding and ideas, I also want to note that there's another phenomenon underway that shouldn't be backgrounded, but I believe needs to be foregrounded, and that is the degree to which, as individual human beings, we've been datafied by the processes that power these big commercial internet companies, this ever pervasive, ever extensive data collection on each and every one of us every time we interact with digital systems, creating personae and portraits and clusters and categories of us that frankly, we as individuals and even as collectives have almost no visibility into and certainly very little control over. So we have this datafied shadow that is being used and manipulated and sold to and sorted by political campaigns and manipulated by misinformation and both deliberately malicious actors and others. And so there's actually a sort of new, an additional sense of ourselves out there that we really don't have the kind of control an agency over that we have over our physical selves. And in addition to that agency now being held by states with whom some of us may have some form of social contract, and that's a point of intervention to repair this damage, it's held by corporations, the responsibility for which and the use of and our interactions with is an entirely different ballgame. Finally, I want to just add one more thing, because I think as we think to not just the recent past and the present, but to the coming future, one of the most important things for us all to recognize about the role of digital systems, be it beyond social media, but basically anything that's digitally driven and digitally connected, and here speaking off of what Frank said about AI, is the extent to which these systems now power our lives in physical spaces. We're seeing this all around us as there are malicious hacks on energy grids and oil pipelines and things like that. But the challenge goes beyond that. When we as individuals, some of us, depending on your degree of digital technology usage, are wired in creating data throughout our sleep lives, let alone when we wake up and leave our homes. But the kind of physical artifacts that are coming into our homes, that some of us are wearing on our bodies, and that we're certainly interacting with in physical space, be that our own home, our office space, or theoretically public spaces for gathering and assembly, we are data generators. And again, we have very little sense and control over what that data is used for. And this isn't only a surveillance problem. It's very much a closing space challenge to those who are trying to actually share ideas, engage in that process of knowledge that Frank mentioned, or come together to take action either directly into the political sphere or directly in the marketplace, or outside of both of those. So there's really sort of three extensions to what Frank put on the table that the Digital Civil Society Lab pays attention to and thinks are the primary concerns for democracy in this digital age. Back to you, Frank.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Lucy. So I think really the challenge that all of us have been facing is what to do about this, given the analysis that we've just put forward. And I would say that there are several broad approaches to the problems posed by this concentration, this enormous concentration of power in these big platforms, and concentration in big governments like that of China, in order to combat the harms, the political harms that we've seen. Now, the most straightforward way is to regulate. This is the approach that is favored by the Europeans, both at the EU level and by individual member states of the European Union. And so you've got this new Digital Services Act that the EU Commission has put forward. You had the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulations, that were enunciated about 3 years ago. And you've got attempts to criminalize fake news, like the NetzDG law that the German government parliament passed a couple of years ago. I think that these are worthwhile as far as they go, but you get on very dangerous territory when even a democratically elected government tries to regulate content, political content. And I think many of these efforts run up against, in America, it would be the First Amendment, or it would be freedom of speech rights that every liberal democracy has in its basic law, because the government actually is not, in the end, supposed to be the arbiter of what's true and what can be said in the political sphere. That hasn't prevented governments from trying to regulate, including that of the United States. So back when the big three broadcast networks were the dominant purveyors of information in the 1950s and 60s, the Federal Communications Commission had something called the Fairness Doctrine, which didn't dictate what those media channels could say, but it said that you ought to be balanced and impartial in the way that you present the views of differing political actors right now. And I think if you look back at that and imagine what a fairness doctrine would look like in today's United States, you see that it's impossible. Does balance mean that you have to give equal time to Republican assertions that the 2020 election was stolen, when that's just a completely false assertion? And I think that it means that you can do this kind of regulation maybe in Germany or Sweden or Denmark, or a country where there still is a fair amount of social consensus and trust in government. But in a highly polarized country like many of those in Eastern Europe or in the United States or in Southern Europe, that's pretty hard to imagine. Another route is antitrust. Simply break up these big concentrations of power. And in fact, I started a working group looking at antitrust issues at Stanford last year. What we decided very quickly was that that might be a remedy for the economic harms that are caused by concentrated platform power, but it's not a particularly good solution for the political harms that we've been talking about. And in particular, while it's nice to fantasize about breaking up Google or Facebook, legally to do this either in Europe or in the United States would take 10 years. It would take literally tens of thousands of lawyers. And even if you did it, it's not clear that it would help, because a baby Facebook might grow to be the size of the parent Facebook, very, very quickly, given the underlying economics of networks. And so that just didn't seem like a good solution. A third approach is to use privacy law. And this is what GDPR in Europe does. One of the big advantages that any of these big platforms has is that it's got a lot of data on all of us. In Google's case, it's really scary, because if you merge all the data from Google Maps with Google Chrome and Gmail, they basically know where you've been, who you've talked to, what you had for lunch yesterday, and the like. And I think that people would be much more worried about privacy if they understood how much these platforms know about you. In China, of course, it's the government that has that information. In the West, it's these big private technology companies. And if you took privacy seriously, you would prevent those platforms from taking the data that they gathered, let's say because they sold you a book, and prevented them from using it to sell you diapers or groceries or something else without getting your explicit permission. And this is something that European privacy law tries to prevent. The problem with this approach is that, in a way, the cat is already out of the bag. That although you may prevent future misuses of data, these big platforms have so much information about you already that it's really closing the barn door on a horse that has escaped a long time ago. So it's not clear to me how effective that'll be. The final, well, that leaves us with the current solution, which I also think is not really adequate, which is to pressure the platforms to self-regulate. The political winds have shifted 180 degrees over the last 3 or 4 years, really since the Trump election in 2016. Whereas most Americans thought that the platforms were really great for democracy, they've come to realize the dangers. And there's been tremendous pressure on them to clamp down on fake news, conspiracy theories, hate speech, and the like. And they've done that. And the deplatforming of Donald Trump after the January 6th attack on the Capitol is simply the most prominent case of the platforms using their private power. And I think that although I personally am happy that Twitter and Facebook took the decisions they did, because I do think that the falsehoods that were being put out by former President Trump and his followers were genuinely dangerous to American democracy, I don't think that that is a long-term solution to the problem. It's not legitimate for a large private company, not answerable to democracy itself, but answerable only to its shareholders, to make politically important decisions about what is acceptable and what is not. And that's not a problem just for the United States, it's a global problem. So Facebook, for example, has been blamed for taking down anti-Modi comments in India because of their fear of offending, Prime Minister Modi. And you have many similar cases of this where the platforms have basically given into political pressure from different governments, in some cases authoritarian ones or would-be authoritarian governments. And so again, I don't think that this is a long-term solution to the problem, because the platforms just don't have either the legitimacy or the capacity to make wise decisions in moderating political content. The proposal we came up with is something we labeled middleware, where the platforms would outsource the content moderation of political speech to hopefully a layer of competitive companies that could tailor the way they moderated things to the individual user's preference. And this gets at something that Lucy had alluded to, the fact that these big companies are completely non-transparent in the way that they present information to you. Right, so you don't have any idea, when you do a Google search, you don't have any idea why the search results are coming up the way they are, or on your news feed on Facebook, you don't know why certain things are ranked higher than other things. And if you don't like the way that those searches are done, you have no way of controlling them. And our suggestion was that if you could actually choose the another company, another party, to rank and rate and in a way moderate the content that you saw, it would give back to individual users greater control over their internet experience, and therefore over the information that they saw. I'm going to leave it at that, because there's a lot of questions that have been raised about the viability of this kind of approach. But that's kind of a survey of what I see as sort of major approaches to solving what everybody, I think, now recognizes as a big problem for liberal democracies around the world. Lucy, back to you.
Great, thanks, Frank. And that was a really useful rundown of sort of the major policy proposals, and I'm eager to hear more about the middleware work. But so I'm going to skip over what I was going to say about public policy, because Frank just laid out those options so cleanly. And let me just say that at the when we think about digital civil society, a couple of things are sort of framing in our thought, and that is that really sort of creating a democratic future in the digital age requires not just focus on either the technology or the democracy side of it, but both of them at the same time. And so we break that down even further to thinking about public policy as a lever that Frank just described, but two others that are important that I want to bring to the front. One is the technology itself. And when I say the technology, I'm not just thinking about the app or the sensor, but the package of rules that are part of that technology itself, whether those are designed into it by the enterprise that's creating it or are required by regulation, but actually really reimagining the technology itself, but also because our focus is on civil society, understanding the new responsibilities of all kinds of organizations and institutions in a digital age, and what these institutions themselves may be morphing into. So two other areas where there's an extraordinary opportunity for new imagination and innovation. And here I want to bring in the very important work that's happening around the world, led by Black women scholars in particular, of thinking about liberatory technology, to go back to where Frank started us. And there's a whole very exciting global movement of work that's sort of comes from a civil right in the US, a civil rights framework, a more collective approach to participating in democracy, and is really being designed and advocated for and led by people who've been oppressed and left out of the core central functions of democracy since, in the US context, since this country was founded, but also in other parts of the world. There's a sort of hierarchy of resisting, refusing, and reimagining that centers actually trying to come up with meaningful, implementable approaches to both technology and institutional structure that center collective identity, not only individual identity. This is a real challenge in the United States. Our liberties framework, our rights frameworks generally focus on individuals, and what the internet is largely one of the things we're realizing is that we don't have mental models, let alone laws and frameworks for really protecting collectives of people. And so I think that's an opportunity that other knowledge traditions and other political traditions actually could be very helpful with in imagining what technology that centers the safety and security, privacy of collectives might actually look like. And there are examples in these regard. Same with institutions, reimagining what we think of as the governance structures of not-for-profits, or perhaps even the organizations that might fit into that middleware category that Frank is talking about. Is that going to be simply corporate structures competing as we've always have in the analog marketplace, or are there new requirements that would need to be built into the governance structures of those institutions to ensure that they are some kind of perhaps fiduciary responsibility, a generalization of that to this datafied selves that currently exist. So just adding to the public policy options, I think what we need are a couple of things, all of which are being worked on. One are frames for thinking about collective rights. The second is thinking a much deeper and more digitally appropriate understanding of harms. And the third is, and there's a robust conversation happening about what's variously called the public digital infrastructure. And this actually takes on right at the heart of it, the network effects that Frank has mentioned, and argues for creating pluralistic and small alternatives to the concentrated power that we're familiar with, and finding ways to make those actually robust alternatives to the big guys, if you will, in a recognition that, in fact, while the network effects have served corporate interests incredibly well, they don't seem to be doing much for the rest of us. So I'll leave those ideas out on the table for people to grab at and ask questions about. And I think, Frank, with that, I think we go to questions now, or more comments from us.
Right.
We can jump into the Q&A portion, and I want to thank you both so much for laying out both the issues that we're facing and some, potential solutions or opportunities to build kind of collaborative civil society movements to address these. To that very point, Lucy, I want to start off with a question for you based on the community we have with us joining in this program. So it's a collection of CIPE partners that are, representatives of local business communities and think tanks from across the globe. And of course, the Leadership Network for Change Fellows that CDDRL works with. You talk a little bit about the need for civil society to be better equipped to, shape the public policy around technology and its uses in our society, our economies, our political systems, and also the need to kind of understand the back-end technical elements of this technology, whether it be to better regulate it or at least understand the extent to which the information about us is being captured and used and shared, whether it be for commercial purposes or, in authoritarian governments. But what are some of the skills or capacity do you see that civil society really needs to build up or strengthen or understand in order to participate adequately in this process? I'm just thinking, there tends to be a big gap between those of us who maybe follow tech policy and those of us who really have an appreciation for the technical side. And when we think of a lot of our civil society partners, I wouldn't say there's, a huge community of folks with a great understanding of AI or machine learning or some of those. So what are the core areas that you think civil society should be investing in terms of their education in this space to then be better equipped to shape that going forward? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Louisa. A couple of things. One, there's a lot of talk about digital literacy all the time, and I'm not even sure what that means, but sure, it can't be a bad thing. But it actually can be a bad thing if it becomes an enormous opportunity cost for the bigger questions. I think what civil society actors really need to bring to the table, which they have, most of them, is the ability to take some sort of political analysis, power analysis of the way the digital systems that they use are affecting the issues that they work on. So if that's health or education or entrepreneurship training or immigration or whatever it is, you cannot name a domain of civil society now that I can't come right back to you and show you where the digital systems, those digital dependencies I mentioned, are shifting the way that work happens, and the policy and power dynamics of that issue. So leading with civil society's extant expertise in the issues and the communities that they work with and come from, that expertise needs to be allied with the similarly situated expertise on digital tech policy. I mean, most of the expertise on tech policy that isn't directly aligned with corporate or government interests, where's it coming from? It's coming from academia and civil society. So when we talk about digital civil society, we're not just talking about those groups that have tech policy at their heart, although they're part of it, because they only have half the equation. The other half of the expertise lives in those groups that understand the lived experience and harms of the communities they're working with. So those two come together in what we refer to as an integrated advocacy approach. And that brings the collective kind of expertise. But the knowledge hurdle that I think is real is we've all been subjected to, 3 decades of being told that tech is complicated and you can't possibly understand this. And the only way you can understand it is if you're a software coder. That, by the way, is exactly the same line of reasoning that big oil, big tobacco, big pharma, there's nothing new in that argument. It's sure, if you have tech skills, those are really helpful. Those are really valuable. My colleagues, Frank and I have colleagues, Rob Reich, Jeremy Weinstein, Mehran Sahami, who have a new book just out called System Error, about how the actual real engineering mindset can be informed and helped to sort of address, bring some of that tech expertise specific to problems of democracy. But it's not a tech problem. It's a social problem and a political problem and an economic problem. And that expertise exists in civil society. Pairing it with that tech policy expertise, which also exists in civil society, is the path forward.
Great, thank you so much for that. And Frank, to your comments about sort of the issues we're seeing and as they relate to both what's happening in democratic societies and authoritarian countries, both looking at some of the commercial activity of big tech, as well as, the digital authoritarian actors out there, such as China. One of the things that we're working on is how do we create a counter narrative to not just, the tech dystopian future we feel like we're all hurtling towards, or this, kind of democracy doesn't work well in the digital age. Authoritarian countries are much more equipped to deal with this, and look how successful China is. What is that, positive vision for democracy? What's a piece of that narrative so that our communities here, when, they listen to both of you outline these complex issues and the approach we need to take to start, seeing some solutions and building towards solutions, how do we power that hope or sense of optimism? I'm asking you to really distill this down to, a couple of phrases or thoughts, but why is democracy the right approach to kind of lead us into this technological future where we all can prosper and benefit?
I'm not sure that looking for a counter narrative is necessarily the best approach. I mean, you do need a narrative, but the problem goes a lot deeper than just having the narrative. So for example, right now you've got this big problem with China and the company Huawei spreading 5G surveillance technology along with its marketing of networks in developing countries. And this is true, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, it's going on in Eastern Europe, right in the heart of countries that are members of the European Union. And quite frankly, I don't see any alternative narrative that's really going to counter that terribly effectively. What you actually need are some real competitive alternatives. And, it's completely crazy that um, the United States and other Western countries did not have an industrial policy that actually promoted domestic telecoms providers. We kind of let that capability leach out. I sort of think under the influence of a certain form of kind of neoliberal economic thinking, where it didn't matter who provided it as long as they did it efficiently. And if the Chinese want to provide it, then more power to them. But politically, I think that that was a big mistake. And so I do think that if you're going to effectively counter that, you actually have to have resources, alternatives. You've got to have alternative providers, because otherwise, I don't see how you persuade a poor country not to accept this bargain that the Chinese are offering them, where they can get a 5G network that's state of the art, and they can also monitor their citizens in ways that they simply weren't able to previously. So that requires a lot of work. I mean, it really requires kind of reorienting a lot of basic policies to pay attention to the capability to do things like build infrastructure. That's been one of my big research concerns in the last few years is, and actually we've taught a lot of this in our Leadership Academy for Development courses, focusing on things like how do you enlist the private sector to help build critical infrastructure, including digital infrastructure that many countries need. I would say that if you want to simply focus on narratives, the narrative coming out of COVID is going to be actually a very interesting one, because a general observation I would make is that populist governments have not really done all that well in dealing with COVID. I mean, you've got Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Lopez Obrador in Mexico, Trump in the United States, and now a lot of these mini Trumps in Eastern Europe that have really made a mess of handling the pandemic. I mean, I sort of think that there's probably a systematic connection there, because populist leaders don't want to do unpopular things like ordering shutdowns and mask wearing and this sort of thing. And they've all made tremendous mistakes. And so I think that in the end, accountable democratic government that has the capacity to lead citizens to do things that may not be in their immediate self-interest, but are, in the long-term interest of the society as a whole, there's a very positive story that can be told about, how that can be done effectively in a democracy. And there's just a chance that this may take some of the gleam off. I mean, for just an example that was just in the news, that it turns out that a lot of the countries that have gotten massive quantities of this Chinese vaccine are experiencing yet another wave of COVID, because apparently the vaccine isn't all that good. And I do think there's a big opportunity for the United States, now that it's taken care of its own population, to really push back by offering countries an alternative. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, I think there's a narrative that can be told, but if it's not backed by some actual resources and policies, I think it's not going to be a terribly persuasive one.
Thanks very much, Frank. That's very helpful. I mean, we do think about, both the narratives and then the work behind making those narratives a reflection of the reality of living and working in our democracies. I have a follow-up question here from Bill Kakenmaster, who asks, is there room for an account of variation in different democratic forms in the future of digital politics? He's thinking about the difference between majoritarianism and consensus democracies, or perhaps more social welfare-oriented democracies. And Lucy, feel free to chime in if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Well, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs trying to relate success in dealing with COVID to different forms of government, which you could also apply to managing kind of the digital challenges that we've been facing. And I have to say that a lot of the stuff that I wrote a year ago turned out to be not correct because, as time has gone on, different countries have proved to be better at certain things than others. So I do think that presidential systems are dangerous in a way that has really been underlined by the COVID pandemic. If you have a winner-take-all system in which you vest so much power in a single individual, what happens if you manage to elect a total idiot, an incompetent idiot as president? And without naming specific names, I think we've elected a few of those in the last few years. That one individual can do a tremendous amount of damage that could not occur in a parliamentary system where the parliamentary party could actually just replace the prime minister with a different prime minister. That's one thing. I do think that it's underlined the importance of basic state capacity because if your state doesn't have the infrastructure to regulate activities, whether it's in the digital domain or in public health or in other areas, it's simply not going to work terribly well. But the final condition is one that I don't think is a matter of visible formal institutions. It's really a matter of social trust. In fact, I was in a discussion just a couple of days ago where somebody raised a question about whether there isn't a strong correlation between vaccine hesitancy and basic trust in government, because what you're seeing in many countries is real resistance to vaccine campaigns, vaccination campaigns. And it's very telling that people don't want to take vaccines because they simply don't trust the government, that they know what they're doing or that they don't have ulterior motives and so forth. And that's an intangible quality of different societies that is hard to measure, but I think is really important because if you don't trust the government and you don't trust your fellow citizens, it's hard to do public policy of any sort. It doesn't matter whether that's health or digital regulation or anything else. And where that trust comes from is the topic of another long discussion. But maybe Lucy has some reflections on this because it really is a matter of that civil society that she works with.
Yeah, I build off of that to say that what we've seen globally in COVID has been a spotlight turned to what have been long existing mutualistic relationships in civil society. In the US, they're not kind of codified within the nonprofit sphere, so they can be pushed to the edges. But that very small, very local set of mutual relationships, whether that's about food and caring and shelter, or money, and where money fits into that, is getting a lot, is growing and strengthened. It was never absent, but it's become more visible. And there's a lot in there that might, with the right intentions, or with the intention to shift, build trust and attach that, if you will, to changes in actual institutions of government. I think there's a path forward there on the social trust. I think it starts at a very small and local level. So getting that up to the level at which global pandemics can in fact be managed is a huge lift. And I don't know the path from small to global. I do think that there are also, let's be very clear, political actors who were very intent on drawing attention to the capacity of local supports in a deliberate effort to degrade the power of formal governing institutions. That I think one of the things civil society does not do as well as it should is understand where it's actually working in opposition to something. There's a whole lot of often unwarranted optimism, let me put it that way. And so again, I turn to the lessons we can learn from communities and scholars who have never had faith in the government. It's never served them, yet have survived and thrived and have things to teach us both about how to organize, how to use technology safely, and how to make decisions and resource allocations that are fairer. And if there's an optimistic light for me, and I'm not known for my optimism, it would be that those insights and those perspectives move more firmly to this into the mainstream as we realize that letting those who've been most systematically marginalized by both the technology infrastructure, but more importantly, the democratic infrastructure, imagine an inclusive future is a good way to go.
Thanks, Lucy. That's really helpful. There is a question here that I want to probe you a bit further on that. So from Talernor, they're mentioning that, when it comes to democracy, privacy, data security, et cetera, how can that all be aligned, especially if, to a large extent, because technology is global or the internet is global, it is a global issue, and yet locally there's differing definitions or perhaps approaches to that, whether it be by civil society, the commercial sector, or it's just sort of application of all the foreign companies and technologies. So, I mean, how do you see that balance, like the hyper-local approach with something that is a truly global phenomenon that is social media, the internet, et cetera?
So two things there. One, I want to pick up on something Frank said earlier, which is when he was talking about China and 5G systems in Africa. There's a third path that rarely gets talked about, and it's relevant here with COVID as well, which is to imagine a world in which the infrastructure building is local. The investment may be from external forces or global, but it's not as simply a market grab. It's actually about building that capacity locally. I mean, imagine if there'd been a global effort to invest in local vaccine development in every country in the world the minute it was clear that this was a global pandemic. Actual manufacturing capacity for the vaccine with a different IP regime, obviously, for the contents of the successful vaccines. We'd be in a very different situation. And yet that seems like something we can't even say out loud. Same would be true with technology infrastructure. Again, back to the idea that you could have interoperable systems, but they don't need to be all run from East Menlo Park or Mountain View, California, that in fact people in different places would have access to a variety of social media choices, a variety of networks, and the internet did work this way once upon a time. Not totally, that's being too Panglossian, but where there were locally, culturally relevant choices. Now, this is sort of anathema in the world of internet talk, that one global internet is what we've long aspired to, but we don't have that now. We have a very balkanized internet now with two handfuls of major corporate players. I think it's probably worth reconsidering where the infrastructure itself and the rules are being written are. The pursuit of a set of global norms for companies based in the US that extend themselves globally, or based in China that extend themselves globally, that's one kind of problem that we're struggling to solve. Maybe there's a way to imagine a different set of puzzle pieces.
Great, thank you so much. I want to turn back to Lucy and Frank. We have a question here from Bill Katkenmaster, So can you talk a bit more about how trust in government might correct misaligned incentives in other policy areas too? And if it seems like trust in government underlies pretty much all of the distributive politics questions, including COVID, how can I trust that the government will deliver on these diffuse policy benefits when the costs are concentrated on me? And this is also, at least in the US, compounded by rural resentment, where basic state capacity might be lower than in urban areas, and so forth. Do you have any sort of thoughts and responses to that perspective?
So trust in government is a really complicated issue that's got a lot of different dimensions. The one that I've been focusing on, and that we've kind of reoriented some of the teaching in our Leadership Academy courses to look at these issues. One path towards greater, so if it's the question, do you trust the government, in a very big abstract level, that's really hard to answer, and it's very unclear how you increase it other than by having trustworthy behavior by governments, and that's not so easy to achieve. But on a smaller scale, a lot of trust, has recently been generated through participation, that there isn't a single, especially democratic society that doesn't undertake to consult citizens, not just in elections that take place every 4 years or so, but as a project is being done, you have town halls, you have participatory budgeting, you have transparency, so civil society organizations can look at the books of projects as they're being undertaken. And we actually teach several really interesting cases where that trust was broken because the government and the private sector partners working together somehow didn't do the right thing. They tried to manipulate, the public in ways that people could see through. And in many respects, actually, transparency may not help if transparency actually just exposes, the seamy side of decision making without giving people actual mechanisms of accountability. So that's something that I think we need to think much more systematically about, because everybody talks about participation as a route towards greater trust in government, but exactly how that works and what the best mechanisms for, participatory behavior are pretty complicated. I just have to leave it at that, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. I see we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure Lauren has a chance to share a bit more about our local grant project. But Lucy, I want to give the last word to you. I've mentioned who our attendees on this event are. What's a starting place in your mind if you're on this call and you're listening to you and Frank discuss a number of these threats and challenges and opportunities, especially for civil society to take on a bigger role when it comes to, addressing how technology is influencing our lives and our democracies and our economies. What's a first step? What might they consider as, a potential collaboration grant across our government, civil society, and business community that are all here today listening to the two of you?
Thanks, Louisa. Let me say two things. One, civil society is where the solutions are going to come from. I'm quite clear on it, especially these incentive questions about designing alternative technological systems, imagining different institutional structures, and certainly putting forward policy proposals and regulatory actions that protect the most vulnerable. That's going to come from civil society. The incentives are too rigidified. Perhaps this is a sign of my own lack of trust of the other two sectors. And frankly, for those decision makers, they're just simply too rewarding. People have benefited too much to possibly be interested in actually changing these dynamics. So the answers are going to come from civil society. Within civil society, I think there's really first order things people can do within whatever organization they work at. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, which is to recognize whatever problem you're working on, whatever issue you're trying to solve, it is shaped by a political economy of actors and power dynamics, and a quick analysis in your own organization about how digital technologies are entwined in that power analysis, even if you feel you don't have the capacity in-house at the start of this to fully unpack that, to identify those intersections. Trust me, it will be eye-opening because it's going to be pervasive. You're going to quickly realize that everything from your payroll to your personnel to your policy decisions are entangled with what we refer to as tech policy, even though I'm beginning to think, well, that's not serving us well, is to realize that these policy questions, these digital dependencies are absolutely pervasive. And whatever you exist to be working on, it is now being shaped by those technologies. So after you've done that kind of self-inventory, then it's a process of finding the allies in your local environment, those digital experts, and they exist. They're out there. So that's my advice.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think all the organizations participating today, definitely have room to do some of that internal looking and work.
One last, if you go to digitalimpact.io, whole set of free resources there to help you do exactly that. Just to be clear, this isn't something you have to go make up on your own. Lots of resources exist. Digitalimpact.io is hosted by the lab and is designed by and for civil society to think about these digital dependencies.
Fantastic. Well, perhaps we'll be sponsoring a grant to do just that type of work. And on that note, thank you so much, Lucy and Frank, for your thoughtful comments and suggestions and solutions and answering the questions. Apologies to anyone who submitted a question that we weren't quite able to get to. And I'll now turn it over to Lauren to share more about our local democracy in action grants.
Thank you, Louisa. I've put the call for proposal, both links in the chat if you'd like to take a look at those. And before I introduce the application, I would like to extend my thanks to our director Fukuyama and PACS's Lucy Bernholtz for the engaging and cautiously optimistic conversation. I'd also like to thank the entire team at CIPE, particularly Louisa Tomar and Ritika Singh, for their valuable partnership on this event and with the entire local democracy in action grants process. Their partnership has helped push our grant offerings to the next level, and I'm excited to see what new connections and partnerships result. Finally, I would like to thank Luminate Group, whose generous support has funded these projects in the past and will continue to fund a portion of these grants moving forward. I suspect this audience needs very little in the way of an introduction to the Leadership Network for Change, but I thought I'd mention that we're now quite an impressive network of nearly 2,000 mid-career global public policy reformers, all graduates of our Draper Hill Summer Fellows Program, the Leadership Academy for Development, and the Ukrainian Emerging Leaders Program. Luminate Group has supported multiple rounds of these grants in the past, resulting in projects working to bolster international democratic development from every possible angle, while forging stronger connections between the institutions and individuals that make up our network. With the inclusion and participation of the CIPE network, we hope to offer the expertise, support, and inspiration necessary to kickstarting projects with the potential for far-reaching impacts. We also hope to encourage you to think through ways of solving entrenched public policy issues using the new tools and techniques available to our increasingly interconnected world. With that in mind, we put the call for proposals with detailed instructions for applying in the chat. And as I put on the chat as well, the call is also available on CIPE's website and will soon be available on LNC's website. We do have one coming. Similar to past years, we will require that you work with at least one other network member on a proposed project. If you have a brilliant idea for a project and are looking for an alum to partner with, please make sure that you filled out the Google form that was circulated in the chat earlier. We will also be posting that on the Facebook group. And the deadline for submitting a proposal is exactly 1 month from today, July 23rd, 2021. And if you have any questions while crafting your proposals, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us listed on the published call. I encourage you all to let your imagination run wild, and we're looking forward to helping make your projects a tangible reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And we're so excited to see collaborations between CIPE partners and LNC, and we are excited to help facilitate those connections. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Thanks again to Frank and Lucy, and we hope to stay in touch and see you all again soon. Take care, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe.
Okay, thank you.